All right, well let's get started. We're going to move in tonight to the early part of chapter 7, 7 1 through 12. So we're getting to the home stretch of the sermon, two-thirds or a bit more of the way through. And we're going to get to maybe the most famous line in the sermon. In 7:12, we're going to hear always do to others as you would have them do to you. And that golden rule sits sort of atop an ethical pyramid, maybe for a lot of people. We're going to get to that eventually, but we're going to go through some steps to get there. And in the process of going through those steps, we'll also need occasionally to cast our eyes back. So I hope that you are, as we get into the sixth week here, I hope that you are sort of holding on to the things that you've grabbed along the way. And I'll try to fortify that grabbing. I'll try to fortify that recollection for you as we get especially to a certain part of what we're going to talk about tonight. But welcome, and let's dig right in. Last week we were with Bobby McFerrin and Bob Marley as our starting point. Uh, tonight, hang on. Tonight we are going to begin with another celebrity who may not be as familiar to all of you. His name is Dana Carvey, and he was a Saturday Night Live legend, not least because of the very costume that we're going to see him in as soon as I can cast it up, and that is now. This is Dana Carvey as the church lady. Famously, he would on SNL, which has had so many legendary comic moments. He would host guests who were superstars in the celebrity world and take on some aspect of what they were in the news for from a very puritanical point of view. And so he would unpack what they had become famous for, which sometimes would be being scantily clad, or sometimes they're lately in the news for something they said, and he would kind of take it on from a moralist's perspective, and it usually ended with the line, "Well, isn't that special?" And became an embodiment of being what has since become an adjective. We call people a little judgy, right? Judgy has made its way in a place of judgmental, but Dana Carvey brought that onto the screen, and we get tonight to an antidote, possibly, for the Dana Carvey that is in all of us. We get to, in 7:1, Jesus' word to his disciples: do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Now, judge not lest ye be judged is the most famous part of this. And what follows is sort of interesting, right? Because it summons a little bit the Lord's Prayer in chapter 6, in which we asked, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, or forgive us our debts as we forgive those our debtors. And at the end, he says, for if we do not, he goes back to that. For if we do not forgive, we will not be forgiven. So there's a sort of reciprocal thing in that. And we see it chased up here again. So the famous part is don't judge so that you won't be judged. But then there's this logic of it that it may condition our ability to not be judged ourselves in a sort of more encompassing way. And so Dana Carvey comes to be the poster child for a way that initially here Jesus seems to be wanting us to get rid of, right? But the question becomes, what kind of judgment is Jesus forbidding here? Because we live in an age in which I'm a bit of a sports fan. Boring Super Bowl, by the way. I don't know if you watched it, but the defense was a little too good. I'm on a fan page for the Texas Longhorns football team because we live here in Austin and burnt orange is a big thing. And it's amazing. I can go in any given day and one person will post something and at least 5 people will call them stupid. And not just in oh, that wasn't very smart. I mean in vehement sort of judgment that this person isn't worth the space she or he has used typing. And that's just about a football game, right? That's just about a football team. It gets doubled down in political circles. If you spend any time on X, formerly Twitter, or any time on social media, you will see these takedowns that are about assessing that the other person isn't worth the breath and the air that they're taking from us when they breathe. We live in a fairly cocksure, judgmental age, and it shows up at its most extremes in social media, but it shows up in other ways in day-to-day life. So I said in my invitation in the email that was sent to you on Thursday, I said that this part of the sermon may be the most on the mark for us in the American culture and in the cultures of the world, maybe the most on the mark for us of any part of the sermon. And that's pretty hot competition, right? The sermon has touched us in different ways along the way, but let's see how this lands among us. And the question I want to ask is, what sort of judgment is Jesus talking about? Is he talking about general assessment of truth or value? Is he talking about judging an idea, or is he talking about judging a person? Which, if you read any of the prep guide, you know that Warren Carter, one of the top Matthew scholars, has called into question the idea that judge is the proper way to translate krino in this passage. His suggestion is that it's better translated condemn. Condemn not lest you be condemned, because the kind of judgment he thinks is being made here that Jesus is forbidding or counseling against is not just what you did seems wrong, it's condemnation of the person who did the thing. And so for instance, as we get to the parable, the question becomes, are we not supposed to judge another person's actions or judge another person's words at all, with the usage of the word judge being assess, critique, things like that? Or is Jesus saying we are not supposed to condemn the person who has those ideas or thoughts, right? And so let's read the parable and see if we get any help from it. It's famous. Why do you see the speck? And it comes right on the heels of what we just read. Judge not lest ye be judged, for in the measure that you're judging, you're going to be judged, right? All of that. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own? You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Right? It's a famous picture, a famous word picture of Jesus. And I have pictured his audience laughing. Most of us are familiar enough with it that we can't imagine hearing it for the first time. But I imagine his initial audiences laughed at this specter of a person trying to take a plank, see right through a plank to a little sliver in the other person's eye. So I think it had humorous edge, but I want to notice something about it. Is judgment forbidden here? Take a look and think about it for a second. Is Jesus forbidding judgment if we take the parable seriously? Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own? You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. It's an interesting reality or an interesting point that Jesus at the end says, once you have done this self-examination, once you have noticed the log in your own eye and taken it out, noticed the thing that you have that is glaringly wrong or out of place or sinful or whatever it is, you will be able to see clearly to help your neighbor. And by the way, the word here is brother or sister, right? The family language we lose in this translation, it's NRSV, and we lose the family language, which is a cost here, and we'll come back to why. But Jesus doesn't say, take the log out and be done with it. He says, take the log out, and then you'll be able to help your neighbor get the speck out, right? Those are two different things. And so Jesus says that self-examination and the repentance and the transformation or whatever it affects that comes out of self-examination prepares us to be good and helpful assessors of our neighbors. And we're going to get to chapter 18 in a little while in Matthew. If we were to read all the way through Matthew, chapter 18 is going to have a confrontation model where if somebody sins against you, you go and you confront. And if they say, oh, I'm sorry, then the whole business is over and you've made reconciliation. But if not, you take a couple people. And if not that, you go put them in front of the church. If you remember that, there is an assessment of a neighbor. Here it's in 18, it is somebody who has harmed me. I'm beholden to bring that to bear on that person, to confront, which is a form of judgment, right? It's a form of, pardon me, of identification of something that person has done wrong. Now, it doesn't tell me to chase them down if they've done it to somebody else. But the question in play is, are we called to judge people in that regard? And if so, then judging is not generally forbidden. Condemnation is forbidden, if Warren Carter is right. Do you see the difference? And it's not something that we notice that often, that the end point of the parable is to make us see clearly, because now we've removed the things that are getting in the way of that to help our brother or sister, right? I landed at Princeton Seminary, and I was so fired up to be in this Christian community of fellow learners when I was a first-year student at Princeton Seminary. I was doing an MDiv, and I lived on this great dorm floor with great guys. And I about the fourth day I was there, I said, you guys, you know what we could do? We could have an accountability group just to keep ourselves kind of just mind each other's progress in discipleship and all those things. And they all looked so weary when I said it, because we do this so wrongly, right? We assess so wrongly and so kind of ham-handedly. But Jesus has a place in his ideal Sermon on the Mount world for people who are so humble that we can see our own faults, and that clarifies life so that we can get to being useful to one another. The great first century Greco-Roman writer Plutarch, who did a lot of lives of famous people, and then he did a lot of morality writing, said, if you can't find a friend who will tell you when you're off the path, find a good enemy, because we all need somebody who will tell us when we have spinach in our teeth, right? I hear Jesus opening the door to that here, but that's not where we would have thought he was going when he said, judge not, so that you aren't going to be judged, right? He uses the same word there, and here he comes back to, but I want you to be able to help your brother or sister. That's something to chew on about this, because it's not, I think, what you might have entered the room with as an outcome of judge not, right? One of the things that we haven't talked a lot about in this Sermon on the Mount class, because there are so many theories of how it's structured, is structure itself. How are we helped by identifying ways that Jesus has set things up in this rhetoric, in this sermon, or in the way that it's compiled, if it was compiled by Matthew from different sermons? But I want you to notice that last week we were in the don't worry space, right? We were in the lamp of the body is the eye space. We were in that world where Bob Marley and Bobby McFerrin took us. And if you have a Bible, open it to 6 and 19, and you'll notice that Jesus has an exhortation there, right? But if you take a look at Matthew 6:19, it says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." That's the exhortation. Don't store up treasures on earth, but rather store them up in heaven. And after that, he says, the lamp of the body is the eye. If the eye is sound, your whole body will be filled with light. If your eye is bad, your whole body will be filled with darkness. If then the only light you have is darkness, the darkness will be doubly dark, right? But we unpacked that last week, and we found that the good eye is generosity, and the bad eye is miserliness. And so he tells a parable to extend his exhortation. He says, don't store up treasure on earth, but in heaven. And he turns to, in fact, as you're running around, if you exhibit the generosity of God, I have a little parable for you. If you exhibit the generosity of God, then your whole body will be filled with light. If you exhibit the miserliness, the opposite will occur. See, that parable about the eye ends up illustrating, or at least extending, the exhortation. And then in 6:24, he gives the parable of the serving two masters. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and money, right? So the order of things is 6:19, or the order of things is exhortation to a parable about an eye, and then a second parable that's shorter, and then the assurance of the Father's care, where he says, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. Consider the birds of the air. They neither toil nor spin, but Solomon, right? All those things that he says in the follow-up of that. And notice it goes from, if God cares for birds and lilies, how much more will he care for you? From minor to major. Now let's look at what we're seeing here. In chapter 7, verse 1 and 2, we get judge not lest you be judged. And then we get a parable about a guy who has something in his eye, who's trying to take something out of another person's eye, but can't because of the obstacle, right? And then we get to a second parable in 7:6 in Matthew 7. In 7:6, it turns to animals again, the animal kingdom. Do not give dogs what is holy, nor cast pearls before swine, right? For they will turn and trample on you. So there's a second parable to support the eye parable, and then we're going to get around to the Father's care in, is there a person among you who would offer his son a stone if he asks for bread, a snake if he asks for fish? If then you, being evil, he'll say, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good gifts to you? So notice the structures are 1, 2, 3, 4, and even the last thing is from minor to major, right? Now, I don't know if you needed to notice that, right? It's the kind of thing that happens in writing, and we don't always have to unpack it. We don't always have to do the anatomy of the structure in order to feel its effect. But we'll get to one in a little bit that I think we feel the effect of and may not notice And if we look closer, we can appreciate there's design to this. There's a design to this rhetoric that is probably why it works. It's probably why this immortal sermon, this legendary sermon, has had its impact, because it does things like this, right? And so with that, let's get to the next. Here's an anatomy of the parable that we just did. Let me cast out that sliver from your eye is line 1. And behold, the beam in your own eye you should cast out first. The beam from your own eye, let me cast out the sliver from your eye, and look, you've got a beam in your own eye. So first cast out the beam from your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to cast out the beam from your brother's eye. One of the most famous American versions of a chiasm is John F. Kennedy saying, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. A, B, B, A, right? This goes to C and D, but the way in is sort of breadcrumbs for the way out of this. And again, you don't need to notice or even agree that this is the way this is structured. But looking sometimes at the structure of an argument helps us understand why it worked or didn't work. And so I bring this up because somebody, Lanny, in the after chat last week, reminded us that if you stop at the beginning of chapter 7 as if you're in a whole new world, you're not really, because this is an extended side by side, an extended parallelism, and it reminds us that chapter and verse numbers can get in our way, right? Chapter and verse numbers came much later. They weren't in the original manuscripts. They weren't even in early manuscripts, and the ones we have now are quite late. So it's just another one of those exegetical hopes that we can read as if they aren't there and then use them for convenience as we reference them. If you stop at 6 and don't think about 6 as you go to 7, you miss things that the author, the speaker and the author were clearly doing something with. So now let's go to the next part. If we've done the don't judge and the parable about not judging, now we get don't give dogs what is holy, right? Now, I like my dog. He's been back here. He's now, I think he went out to be with Liz. His name's Watson. He's a glorious dog. And like a lot of pet owners, we put him first in the household over any, including our children. So why not give dogs what is holy? It just sounds weird to a pet-loving. I was on the plane last week with a beautiful dog that somebody was treating like a king, and Jesus is saying, don't give what is holy to the dogs. And it's because dogs were regarded a little differently in Jesus's time and place. They were predators, very rarely domesticated, and therefore as predators they even became dangerous because they also kind of would eat dead bodies. We have passages in the Hebrew scriptures that feature some of the things that people were scared about dogs because of. And so dogs were, if Jesus said don't give dogs what is holy in our space, we'd say, hey, wait, don't talk about my dog that way. In their space, it was kind of a shared value that dogs are on the dangerous side of the ledger, or at least on the unpopular side of the ledger. And so when he says this, his audience would have said, okay, I get what you're saying. At some level, they would have said, oh, I see why you wouldn't want to give a good thing to a dog. Here's how some of the passages portray dogs in ancient Israel. Physical violence toward them was considered acceptable in 1 Samuel and Proverbs. To compare a human to a dog or to call them a dog was to imply that they were of very low status. In the New Testament, calling a human a dog meant that the person was considered evil in Philemon 3 and in Revelation. And And when Jesus says, don't give dogs what is holy, he would be participating in this world. So it makes our eyes go to another later part of Matthew. We went to Matthew 18 with judgment. We're going to Matthew 15 to understand how dogs might have been used, how Jews of Jesus' time might have used the term or the figure of a dog. And this one I read in somebody's blog today. This one is among the passages that this blogger wishes Jesus hadn't made, that Jesus hadn't said. And you can assess for yourself. The Canaanite woman, this is the story of the Canaanite woman who stops Jesus on the way as he leaves Jewish territory and gets into Gentile territory. She stops Jesus on the way and pleads for help with her child. And Jesus says, I've come only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And the Canaanite woman came and knelt before Jesus, saying, Lord, help me. He answered, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Right? Now, what do you mean by dogs? There's some evidence that Gentiles were referred to as dogs within Judaism. And of course, there was some sort of systemic disdain for Gentiles. And so it wouldn't surprise. He seems to be using it in that way here. He seems to be using it to distinguish her from the people to whom he's called the lost sheep of the house of Israel, right? Jews. She said, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Right? So she makes this counter argument, and it impresses Jesus. We talked last week about the centurion who inspired Jesus by his great faith. Here we have a woman who is making a good argument for her worthiness to be helped, but the word dog is used very derogatorily. She accepts it in order to get what she needs. But for some of us, it would be a moment in which Jesus seemed to be doing something that Jesus tells us not to do in other places. It could be, as some have interpreted this passage, that Jesus is testing the woman and she ends up passing with flying colors. Or it could be that Jesus learns that his field of reach is greater than he thought. Right? People interpret this passage differently. We won't spend all our time on it tonight because it's a very complex one. But those are the two main pathways to understanding why he would put things this way. We need to remind ourselves about the complex way that Matthew treats Gentiles in this gospel, because he loads the genealogy in chapter 1 with faithful Gentile women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. He has Magi come from the east in a noble cause of worshiping the new king of the Jews. And then in the sermon, as we've seen, he says, don't just aspire to love those who love you. Even Gentiles do that. And in chapter 6 later, the Gentiles are the ones who fret about possessions. In 8:5, as we saw last week, the centurion exhibits so much faith by saying, Jesus, you don't even need to come to my house. Only say the word and my servant will be healed. And then we have this. So it's a back and forth here. Because in 18:17, it's you treat the people who won't repent and say, I'm so sorry I did that when you confront them. Ultimately, if they stay recalcitrant, you treat them as a Gentile or a tax collector. I will say that Jesus tended to find Gentiles and tax collectors and eat with them and talk to them and in ways that other people weren't, but it sounds derogatory. And then there's the guard at the cross who says, surely this man was the Son of God. And finally, there's the Great Commission to all the nations, all the Gentiles. So it goes back and forth in the Gospel of Matthew. It's an interesting study to ask what he thinks of Gentiles. But there are places where Gentiles seem to be kind of referred to derogatorily, and it may be that in our don't give dogs what is holy, that's what's happening. He's talking about people who are outside the faith, outside Judaism. All right, that's a mouthful, but we're going to get to the pearls now. This is Ralph Winter. He was, for a long time, the president of the U.S. Center for World Mission in Pasadena, California. And he came to my undergraduate school, George Fox College, which is now George Fox University, and doing quite well. He is a mission maven of blessed memory. He died in, I think, in the early 2000s. But my roommate, Boyd Morris, had a portrait. I had a poster of Ralph Winter on the wall. That's how big a hero he was. And he was a major mover in the modern missionary movement. That had 7 M's in it. And so he came to our campus, and I got to go to dinner with him. Now, at the time, I was quite the big man on campus. I was the student body president, and probably some things had gone to my head. I thought I was quite something. And so we went to dinner, and we're talking about mission. And I said, okay, Dr. Winter, if you know a little bit about me now, I'm a religion major, philosophy major, and I'm going to seminary to decide whether I'm going to be a scholar or a pastor. Where would you send me in all the world? Where would you send me to do mission? And he didn't hesitate, friends. He didn't hesitate. He said, I don't throw pearls before swine. And I was just taken aback because this seemed so mean to me. I mean, and after I thought about it, I realized I was playing a parlor game about something he was extremely serious about, which is people who haven't heard about Jesus yet. And I was sort of, if hypothetically, and he wasn't going to have any of it, this seems to be Jesus saying, discern the value of the time you spend, right? Don't give dogs what is holy. Don't throw pearls to the swine is a judgment process. But as I came away from that engagement with Ralph Winter, I didn't feel condemned. I felt called on the carpet for my flippantness. And that's what I was talking about earlier when Jesus said, clear the log out of your eyes so that you can see clearly. He saw clearly what was in my soul. He saw that I wasn't going to do what he said. If he said go to Outer Mongolia, I wasn't going to go to Outer Mongolia. I was just having coffee. And he saw right through me. He made a judgment about my words. He didn't condemn me. He just didn't have time for it, right? Because in another place, Jesus tells the disciples, if anyone who won't welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town, right? Assessments are all over the place in Jesus's sense of how the well-lived life, how the flourishing life goes, how the purposeful life goes. Judgments like that are all over the place. Condemnation, or the arrogance to think one is above another, gets attacked at every place. When people get arrogant around Jesus, he goes right at it. But that doesn't eliminate making proper assessments of value. Dogs what is holy, pearls before swine are both sort of assessments of value. All right. This is a place, by the way, I'd give this to you as a semi-trivial thing, but the other place in the whole New Testament where dogs and swine come up in the same place is in 2 Peter 2, where he's talking about false prophets. And as he talks about the false prophets, he says it would have been better for these never to have known the way of righteousness in the first place than after knowing it to turn back from the holy commandment that was handed on to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb: the dog turns back to its own vomit, and the sow is washed only to wallow in the mud. Right? So this, I bring this not because it enlightens the passage we just read, but because there's another spot where dogs and pigs get disparaged in a way. And so culturally, it's another place where we can get how people looked at these two animals and understand why Jesus might have put them in his parable, or in his don't give dogs what is holy, in his figure of speech. How are you doing? How are you feeling about judgment at this point? I'm not going to ask you to open your mics yet, but I'm going to read faces a little bit. We've gone through now Jesus's call to I'm going to go ahead and translate it: condemn not, so that you be not condemned. And then the parable that has made it clear that some form of assessment or judgment and helping in order to help a neighbor is still in play. Then we got to, well, we're got to make assessments about how we spend our the pearl of the gospel. By the way, the pearl of great price is a parable in Matthew 13. So when don't throw pearls before swine may just mean don't share the kind of in the Ralph Winter world. Don't waste your time with people that you should dust off your feet with. Again, discernment is a deal. Then we get next to the ask, seek, knock passage, and how it fits is going to be an important question, because if it follows in the train of where we have been, it's going to have something to do with asking for things that are going to make us wiser in the processes that Jesus has already laid out. Now, I say that because you'll remember maybe 2 or 3 times along the way here, I have reminded you that in the history of New Testament scholarship, there have been eras and epochs. And when the New Testament scholarship sort of started being a science, when it went from a mainly allegorical way of reading Bible over to, we're going to read it as people are doing literature and history. We're going to do literature and history with the Bible. The first thing that they started to ask was about sources. Some of you know that the theory of the Pentateuch, Wellhausen's theory of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, was that it was made up of 4 different sources that were woven together in between it, and that shook the Bible reading world. Similar things were done with New Testament, and so sussing out sources was a big deal. But when they got through to that, they then would sometimes characterize the authors as mere collectors. That is, in this case, they would parse out the different sources within the Sermon on the Mount. They would see it as a compilation. They would say, this is from this source, this is from that source. And they wouldn't look for logic in the order, because it was more like, in the famous image, putting pearls on a string, right? They would just the gospel authors were just finding great sayings of Jesus and putting them on a string indiscriminately. They didn't have an order that mattered. But as we've seen in the sermon, Jesus seems to have beginning, middle, and end things in mind. And so, if this started with judgment, this section, and it was, by the way, mirroring a section from chapter 6, which is clever. If it started with judgment and went then to how far judgment can go with the sort of, if you self-examine, you might be able to judge. Then it went on to assess how you give gospel or give time. Now it should have something to do with all of that. When we get to, ask and it will be given to you, search and you will find, knock and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks received, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Right? That's the exhortation. Ask because it's going to work. Right? But what we ask for is kind of the question. Is this just general prayer? Ask, seek, find in a sort of general way. That's usually how it's taken. In other words, it's usually taken as if it's a pearl on the string, as if it's just another great thing Jesus said that may not have anything to do with what just happened. But there came an era in New Testament scholarship where they said, well, these authors seem a little smarter than we gave them credit for being, because look at this and that, and they fit together. And look, Mark 1 and Mark 3 have ironies that break out in them, and you wouldn't have the irony without their being placed next to each other. So scholarship moved, and the trends in scholarship moved to what was called redaction criticism. And that was that the gatherers had more design than they'd been given credit for by the former source critics. So we got that far. Then in the late 20th century, there came a movement of narrative criticism in which people started to look at a gospel as something that was kind of ordered as other literature would be ordered, with a connectedness that was, if not seamless, at least orderly. And in that case, those readers, those late 20th century and beyond readers, would say the things we've just heard ought to matter for our interpretation of what we're about to read. And so ask, seek, and knock probably have as their context, at least, and probably have as their intent, ask for the kind of wisdom that allows you to know how to spend your gospel, how to spend your time, how to make these discernments that we've been talking about over the first parts of this section, right? How do I make those? Well, Solomon got a lot of credit for, he was given one wish by God, right? In the famous passage, he was given one wish. He said, it's almost like Aladdin's lamp, right? But he gets one. And what did he ask for? He asked for wisdom. He said, I am a young man and I know nothing. I need wisdom. And he got huge commendation from God for asking for that. Here we have, I think, implicitly another run at that. Because if I come away from the log in the eye and the splinter in the eye, and then I come away from the dogs and pearls, and I'm feeling like, how am I going to make these decisions? Jesus says, I got you. I got you. Ask, seek, knock. If you ask for wisdom, you'll be following the Solomon path, and you'll get it. And the way he brings that home is with another sort of minor to major. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asked for bread, would give a stone? Or if the child asked for fish, would give a snake? If you then, who are evil, and I think he means relative to the character of God, if you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So Jesus brings this saying about God's character as one who is prayed to, and says God is like a good parent who is going to answer this kind of prayer. If you're asking and seeking and knocking, is going to answer this prayer for wisdom, this prayer for the kinds of things that you'll ask coming out of the two parts that we've just read of Matthew 6 or Matthew 7. Okay, so if we read this in that context, it's not a bad idea to ask for wisdom like Solomon, right? Okay, we're going to need to come down the home stretch now, and we get to the home stretch. This is pure gold bullion, right? Because it's been called the golden rule. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, we hear the first part, and we don't really think that much of the second part. We'll take that on in a second. But in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. And of course, there's been a lot of work done on from whence that came. But let's take a look at that law and prophets thing for a second. You may remember back in the vague ancient past, when we were in the first two sections of the Sermon on the Mount, that in verse 17 of chapter 5, Jesus makes a transition from you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world, over to, I have not come to abolish the law or the prophets. I came not to abolish, but to fulfill. That was the last time we saw anything about law and prophets. And it was in 517. Here we are, chapter and a half later, little more than a chapter and a half, and we get law and the prophets again. And something in us has to have some residual. If we heard this in the 20 minutes it would take to preach it, something in us would be able to track there. But you and I have lived 4 weeks of life since we did that. So we may not remember it. And this is one of the problems with going to church and reading one passage at a time. The whole sermon fits. And this is called an inclusio. It's a rhetorical device by which you start a section by saying something, some formula that you'll then repeat again at the end. And it's almost like an envelope for the content between. So what does that mean? And here's where I'm going to kind of do some backtracking for us. Well, that means that the antitheses, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you. You've heard that it was said, don't kill, I say to no anger. You've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery, I say, don't even lust. You've heard that it was said to those in ancient times, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those. That whole section was a first go at fulfilling the law and the prophets. But it didn't stop at the end of 5, even though the antitheses stopped. It also went through the battle we have with hypocrisy, that we like to gain people's favor, and we sometimes value it over God's favor. And so the next section fits in that because it's more interstates. Go and do your good works in order for God to see them, and the God who sees in secret will reward you. And then coming off that, here's a way to pray. And then coming off that, live in a way that allows your trust in God to flourish so that you don't worry and fret. And then now we're in this section, and all of it has been a way that we fill up the law and the prophets, including, I'm going to self-examine before I assess anybody else, including, I'm going to get better at understanding what things and people's people's role in my life, what things and people are going to be worth my while today. And including, what should I ask for in prayer? Well, wisdom wouldn't be a bad idea. All of that is enveloped. And it all culminates in the great 7:12, which is do unto others as you would have them do to you. For that, this is the law and the prophets. The whole thing between gets enveloped and encompassed as an answer to, how does this all get fulfilled? How do we fulfill God's intentions from the beginning of time? It culminates with, if you're really fully baked, if you're really fully formed, you'll get to a place where you do things to other people because you know that that's what you would want if you were in their shoes, right? This is mature discipleship that has gone through all of those intermediate steps that we've read in the last 4 weeks, right? So the 7:12, the golden rule, becomes a culmination. Now, we know that Leviticus had something to do with this, right? In Leviticus 19, we get, when an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the native born among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I'm the Lord your God. This is the empathic move that the golden rule does, right? Put yourself in the other's place and then ask, what would I wish, right? It also happens earlier in chapter 19. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. This is the other Matthew 22 is going to be where Jesus answers to what is the greatest commandment. Here's the second one, and it's like the first, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so there are Leviticus origins, there are also parallels within the Judaism of Jesus's near time, a little before and a little after. Hillel, when asked to summarize the entire Torah while standing on one foot, states, "What is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor." So a kind of resonance with the golden rule. Pirkei Avot, which is the ethics of the father. Do not judge your fellow until you've stood in his place. Let the honor of your fellow be as dear to you as your own. Do you hear the moral logic of that mirrors the golden rule? And you shall love your neighbor. Whatever you yourself hate, don't do to him. Targums were sort of restatements in Aramaic of a Hebrew text. So here are places where it showed up in Jewish life. Jesus puts it as the culmination of what God is up to in us. When we are fully fulfilling law and prophets, this is what we look like. We look like empathic human beings who are able to sense what is needed by another person and act that way, right? I'm going to close with the church lady again, because it is possible to get to a point where we think, okay, we got to give up on judging. We got to give up on that. But there are reasons to have convictions about truth bear on what we do in this world today, right? It would be a terrible thing for Christians everywhere to fully withdraw from assessing situations. Condemnation, on the other hand, in a cancel culture, condemnation is out of bounds. And that's what I think Jesus is trying to say to first century Jews who were following him and trying to learn what life was to be like. And I think it's probably what he's saying to us as we are trying to follow him and see what life ought to be like in our divided, violent, vengeful time. Not a bad idea to look at the log in our own eye.